April 1945. A small wooden table sat in the courtyard of what had once been a German administrative building, now flying the American flag after the liberation of another European town whose name few would remember, but whose stories would haunt those who heard them forever. Sergeant David Richardson, a 26-year-old intelligence officer from Ohio who had survived Normandy, the Bulge, and countless firefights across France and Germany, pulled up a metal folding chair and opened his standard-issue notebook to a fresh page. Across from him sat a thin woman in her 30s, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her eyes holding depths of experience that seemed impossible for someone so young. The morning sun filtered through the smoke, still rising from nearby buildings, casting long shadows across a scene that appeared deceptively peaceful after months of continuous combat. Richardson had conducted dozens of these interviews since crossing into Germany, gathering intelligence about enemy positions, supply routes, and troop movements from civilians and prisoners who had witnessed the Wehrmacht's retreat. The process had become routine. Ask standard questions, record useful information, and move on to the next source. Most interviews lasted 15 minutes and provided tactical details that helped American forces anticipate German defensive preparations or locate hidden weapon caches. He expected this session to follow the same pattern, another brief exchange of information that would contribute to the systematic documentation of occupied territory as American forces advanced deeper into the crumbling Reich. His pen was ready, his questions prepared, and his expectations set for another routine intelligence-gathering session that would be forgotten within hours. The interpreter, a young corporal who spoke fluent German after growing up in Milwaukee's German-American community, had warned Richardson that this particular survivor had insisted on speaking with American officers about something she claimed was more important than troop movements or weapons positions. She had been discovered 3 days earlier in a bombed-out basement where she had been hiding since escaping from what she described only as a work camp somewhere to the east. Her physical condition suggested months of inadequate nutrition and harsh treatment, but her mental state appeared remarkably alert and determined. She had refused medical evacuation until she could speak with someone who would record her testimony and ensure that others would learn what she had witnessed during her captivity. Richardson had seen enough of war to believe himself prepared for any story a civilian might tell about German occupation policies or military activities. He had witnessed the destruction of cities, the desperation of refugees, and the brutality of combat that reduced human beings to their most basic survival instincts. His notebook contained accounts of executions, forced labor, starvation, and cruelty that had hardened him to the darker aspects of human nature that warfare revealed. Yet as the woman began to speak in a quiet, steady voice that suggested she had rehearsed these words many times during her solitary confinement, Richardson sensed that he was about to hear something that would challenge even his battle-tested understanding of what human beings could endure and what they could inflict upon each other. But what happens when men, who thought they had seen everything, hear stories darker than war itself? The liberation of German-occupied territories in 1945 had confronted American forces with systematic evidence of civilian suffering that exceeded anything encountered during previous military campaigns, forcing soldiers who had been trained for combat operations to become witnesses to atrocities that challenged their understanding of modern warfare and human civilization. As Allied armies advanced across Europe, they discovered not only military prisoners and forced laborers, but entire populations that had been subjected to organized brutality, starvation, and exploitation on scales that defied comprehension. The documentation of these conditions required American intelligence officers to conduct thousands of interviews with survivors whose testimonies would eventually contribute to war crimes prosecutions, historical records, and the broader understanding of Nazi occupation policies. American military doctrine had prepared intelligence personnel for interrogating enemy prisoners and gathering tactical information from civilian sources, but it had not anticipated the psychological challenges involved in recording systematic accounts of deliberate cruelty, organized starvation, and industrial-scale human exploitation. The soldiers assigned to these duties were typically combat veterans who had demonstrated courage under fire and competence in military operations, but their training had focused on battlefield conditions rather than the documentation of civilian suffering. Many found themselves struggling to maintain professional objectivity while recording testimonies that revealed aspects of enemy behavior that went far beyond conventional military operations into realms of deliberate cruelty that challenged basic assumptions about human nature. The scope of civilian suffering discovered by advancing American forces reflected the systematic nature of Nazi occupation policies that had transformed conquered territories into sources of forced labor, economic exploitation, and ideological experimentation on populations deemed expendable by German racial theories. Millions of people from across occupied Europe had been transported to work camps, factories, and agricultural facilities where they were subjected to conditions designed to extract maximum labor value while providing minimal resources for survival. The survivors encountered by American forces represented a fraction of those who had endured these conditions, their testimonies providing windows into experiences that had been hidden from international observation throughout the war. The psychological impact on American soldiers who conducted these interviews was immediate and profound, as men who had witnessed the brutality of combat found themselves confronting evidence of systematic cruelty that exceeded anything in their military experience. Combat veterans who had fought through Normandy, across France, and into Germany discovered that their battlefield experiences, however traumatic, had not prepared them for the methodical nature of civilian suffering that had been implemented as official policy rather than the result of military necessity or combat conditions. The contrast between the chaotic violence of warfare and the organized, bureaucratic nature of the atrocities they were documenting created psychological challenges that military training had not anticipated. The intelligence-gathering process that emerged from these liberation operations required American forces to develop new procedures for recording, verifying, and preserving survivor testimonies that would serve multiple purposes beyond immediate military intelligence. The accounts provided evidence for understanding German administrative systems, resource allocation, and population control methods that might influence ongoing military operations, but they also represented historical documentation of unprecedented importance for post-war justice proceedings and international understanding of Nazi occupation policies. The soldiers conducting these interviews found themselves simultaneously gathering military intelligence and preserving historical records of experiences that many survivors believed would never be believed or understood by those who had not lived through them. The systematic nature of the testimonies that emerged from these interrogations revealed the industrial scale of civilian exploitation that had been implemented across occupied Europe, transforming entire populations into sources of forced labor, while maintaining careful records and administrative procedures that demonstrated the bureaucratic organization of systematic cruelty. Survivors described transportation systems, work assignments, food distribution procedures, and punishment methods that had been implemented with the same attention to efficiency and documentation that characterized other aspects of German wartime administration. The methodical nature of these policies shocked American investigators who had expected to find evidence of military brutality. but instead discovered systematic civilian exploitation that had been implemented as routine administrative policy. The cultural shock experienced by American soldiers during these interviews reflected broader differences between American and German approaches to civilian populations during warfare, as the systematic exploitation documented in survivor testimonies contradicted American military doctrine that emphasized protection of non-combatants and adherence to international law governing occupied territories. The testimonies revealed that German occupation policies had been designed to extract maximum economic value from civilian populations, while implementing ideological objectives that treated entire ethnic and national groups as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving basic protections under international law. This systematic approach to civilian exploitation represented a form of warfare that American soldiers had not encountered in their previous military experience. The verification procedures that American intelligence officers developed for assessing survivor testimonies required careful attention to psychological factors, as many survivors had endured experiences that affected their ability to provide coherent chronological accounts while simultaneously dealing with trauma that influenced their emotional responses to questioning. The soldiers conducting these interviews had to balance their need for accurate information with recognition that survivors were still recovering from experiences that had pushed human endurance beyond normal limits. The development of interview techniques that could elicit reliable information while respecting the psychological condition of traumatized survivors required sensitivity and patience that many combat veterans had not been trained to employ. The broader strategic implications of survivor testimonies extended beyond immediate intelligence gathering to influence American understanding of German war aims, administrative capabilities, and ideological objectives that had motivated occupation policies throughout conquered territories. The systematic nature of civilian exploitation revealed through these interviews provided evidence that German leadership had implemented comprehensive plans for reorganizing European society according to racial theories and economic objectives that went far beyond traditional military conquest and occupation. This understanding influenced American strategic planning for post-war reconstruction and denazification programs that would be necessary to prevent the resurgence of ideologies that had produced such systematic civilian suffering. The documentation procedures that American forces developed for preserving survivor testimonies reflected recognition that these accounts represented historical evidence of unprecedented importance that would be needed for post-war justice proceedings and international understanding of Nazi crimes against civilian populations. The soldiers conducting these interviews found themselves serving not only as intelligence officers, but as historians who were preserving first-hand accounts of experiences that would otherwise be lost as survivors died or scattered across the post-war world. The responsibility for accurately recording and preserving these testimonies created additional psychological pressure on soldiers who were already struggling to comprehend the scope and systematic nature of the suffering they were documenting through their interviews with survivors of Nazi occupation policies. The woman across from Richardson began her testimony with the simple statement that she had been a teacher in a small Polish town before the war, a detail that immediately humanized her in ways that military reports rarely achieved. Her voice carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned multiple languages through education rather than desperation, and her manner suggested professional competence that had survived experiences designed to strip away human dignity and individual identity. She explained that her town had been relocated in 1942, a euphemism that Richardson's interpreter translated with visible discomfort, knowing that American intelligence had begun to understand the systematic nature of population transfers that had emptied entire communities across occupied Europe. The methodical way she described the process, officials arriving with lists, families separated into different groups, possessions abandoned, suggested administrative efficiency that had transformed human displacement into routine bureaucratic procedure. The transportation itself, she continued, had been conducted in cattle cars that were packed far beyond capacity for human passengers, with no facilities for sanitation, minimal ventilation, and inadequate space for people to sit or lie down during journeys that lasted for days without stops for food or water. Richardson found himself taking notes that seemed inadequate to capture the systematic nature of suffering she was describing, as her account revealed deliberate design elements that maximized human misery while maintaining transportation efficiency. The deaths that occurred during transport were not accidental casualties of wartime logistics, but predictable consequences of policies that treated human beings as cargo to be moved at minimum cost, regardless of survival rates. Her matter-of-fact delivery of these details suggested psychological adaptation to experiences that should have been traumatic beyond human endurance. Upon arrival at what she termed the work facility, the systematic processing of new prisoners had continued with the same administrative efficiency that had characterized the transportation, involving medical examinations that determined work assignments, confiscation of personal belongings that were catalogued and stored, and assignment to barracks that housed far more people than they had been designed to accommodate. Richardson's pen moved mechanically across the page as she described conditions that had been calculated to maintain workforce productivity while providing minimal resources for human survival. The allocation of food, water, medical care, and shelter followed bureaucratic procedures that treated human needs as variables to be optimized for maximum labor extraction rather than requirements for maintaining human dignity and health. The work assignments themselves, she explained, had been organized according to industrial principles that maximized output, while treating workers as replaceable components in production processes that continued regardless of individual collapse, injury, or death. Her particular assignment had been in a factory that produced components for military equipment, working 12-hour shifts under conditions that would have violated safety standards for machinery operation even before considering basic human welfare requirements. The systematic nature of these operations shocked Richardson, who realized that he was hearing descriptions of industrial facilities that had been designed to exploit human labor while maintaining careful records of production quotas, worker productivity, and replacement rates that reflected administrative attention to efficiency rather than human welfare. The daily routines described in her testimony revealed the systematic nature of psychological as well as physical exploitation, as prisoners had been subjected to procedures designed to eliminate individual identity, personal relationships, and hope for survival beyond immediate work assignments. Richardson listened with growing horror as she described wake-up calls before dawn, roll calls that lasted for hours, regardless of weather conditions, work assignments that continued regardless of injury or illness, and evening procedures that involved additional administrative processing designed to maintain records of individual productivity and behavioral compliance. The systematic nature of these routines suggested deliberate psychological warfare against civilian populations that went far beyond the requirements of labor extraction. Corporal Muller, the interpreter, began showing visible signs of distress as he translated increasingly detailed accounts of systematic starvation that had been implemented through careful calculation of minimum caloric intake necessary to maintain work capacity while preventing the accumulation of physical strength that might enable resistance or escape attempts. The woman's clinical description of hunger's effects on human behavior, social relationships, and mental capacity demonstrated understanding of systematic cruelty that had been designed by administrators who understood exactly what they were inflicting on their victims. Richardson found his military training inadequate for processing information that revealed such methodical application of suffering as administrative policy, rather than the chaotic brutality of combat situations. The medical procedures described in her testimony provided evidence of systematic experimentation on human subjects that had been conducted under the guise of health maintenance for the prisoner workforce, involving treatments and examinations that served no therapeutic purpose, but provided data for research projects that treated human beings as laboratory subjects. Richardson's notebook began to contain information that exceeded his authority to classify or distribute, as the woman's account revealed systematic violations of medical ethics and international law that represented crimes against humanity rather than military operations. The administrative documentation of these procedures, which she had observed during work assignments that involved record-keeping duties, provided evidence of bureaucratic organization that treated systematic cruelty as routine administrative work. The systematic separation of families and communities that had been implemented through carefully designed procedures created additional layers of psychological trauma that complemented the physical suffering imposed through starvation, overwork, and medical exploitation. The woman described witnessing the implementation of policies that deliberately destroyed social support systems that might have enabled psychological resilience or organized resistance, replacing community relationships with administrative categories that treated individuals as isolated units of labor capacity, rather than members of families or communities with mutual obligations and emotional connections. Richardson realized that he was documenting evidence of systematic destruction of human society that went far beyond military occupation into deliberate elimination of civilian social structures. The punishment procedures that had been implemented for maintaining discipline and productivity demonstrated the systematic application of terror as an administrative tool, involving public executions, collective punishments, and individual torture that had been designed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining careful documentation of causes, methods, and results. The woman's account of witnessing these procedures revealed administrative planning that had calculated the psychological effects of various forms of cruelty on prisoner behavior, work productivity, and resistance potential. Richardson found himself recording information that demonstrated systematic study and application of terror as a management technique for maintaining control over civilian populations under conditions of systematic exploitation. The escape attempts that had occasionally occurred despite systematic security measures had been met with responses that demonstrated the systematic nature of reprisal policies designed to discourage resistance through collective punishment that held entire prisoner populations responsible for individual actions. The woman described witnessing retaliation procedures that had been implemented according to predetermined ratios of collective punishment for individual infractions, with administrative documentation that tracked the effectiveness of various reprisal methods in deterring future resistance attempts. Richardson's military experience had prepared him for combat brutality, but not for the bureaucratic organization of systematic cruelty that treated terror as routine administrative policy. The transportation and disposal of prisoners who had become unable to work due to illness, injury, or exhaustion had been conducted according to systematic procedures that maintained administrative efficiency while concealing the systematic elimination of human beings who were no longer economically productive. The woman's account of these procedures, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone that had characterized her entire testimony, provided evidence of systematic killing that had been implemented as routine administrative policy rather than the result of military necessity or combat conditions. Richardson realized that his notebook was beginning to contain evidence of crimes that exceeded anything in his military experience or legal training. The systematic destruction of evidence that had been implemented during the final months of the war demonstrated administrative planning that had anticipated post-war investigations and attempted to conceal the scope and systematic nature of civilian exploitation through careful destruction of records, facilities, and witnesses. The woman's survival had resulted from fortunate circumstances rather than systematic policy, and her testimony represented one of relatively few first-hand accounts of administrative procedures that had been designed to eliminate evidence of systematic civilian exploitation. Richardson understood that he was recording information of unprecedented historical importance that documented systematic crimes against humanity on scales that exceeded anything in recorded human experience. The psychological impact on Richardson himself became apparent as the interview continued, as his military training and combat experience had not prepared him for the systematic nature of civilian suffering that the woman was describing with clinical precision and administrative detail. The contrast between the organized, bureaucratic nature of the cruelty she had witnessed and the chaotic violence of combat created cognitive dissonance that challenged his understanding of warfare, human nature, and the civilization he had been fighting to preserve. The woman's testimony was transforming his understanding not only of enemy capabilities, but of the fundamental nature of the conflict in which he had been participating. The conclusion of the woman's testimony, delivered after nearly 3 hours of detailed account that had filled Richardson's notebook with information that would influence war crimes investigations and historical understanding for decades to come, demonstrated the systematic nature of civilian exploitation that had been implemented as official policy rather than the result of individual cruelty or military necessity. Richardson realized that he had been documenting evidence of systematic crimes against humanity that exceeded anything in his previous experience or imagination, while simultaneously recognizing that this single testimony represented only one account among thousands that would be needed to document the full scope of civilian suffering during Nazi occupation. The woman's final request that her testimony be preserved and shared with others demonstrated her understanding that survival carried obligations to bear witness for those who had not lived to tell their own stories. The psychological impact on American soldiers who conducted these interrogations was immediate and profound, as combat veterans who had believed themselves hardened to the realities of warfare found their understanding of human cruelty fundamentally challenged by systematic accounts of civilian suffering that exceeded anything in their military experience. Richardson and hundreds of other intelligence officers throughout the European theater began showing symptoms of what would later be recognized as secondary trauma, as the cumulative impact of recording survivor testimonies created psychological burdens that military training had not anticipated. The contrast between the chaotic violence of combat and the systematic administrative nature of the atrocities described in survivor accounts created cognitive dissonance that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of warfare and human civilization. The morale impact on American forces varied dramatically between units and individuals, as some soldiers found their determination strengthened by evidence of enemy atrocities that validated their participation in the war effort, while others struggled with depression and psychological breakdown that resulted from exposure to systematic cruelty beyond their previous comprehension. Officers responsible for managing these interrogation programs began implementing rotation policies and psychological support procedures that had not been anticipated during pre-war planning. Recognizing that exposure to survivor testimonies created mental health challenges that required professional intervention, the systematic nature of the suffering documented in these interviews exceeded the psychological preparation provided by even the most comprehensive military training programs. The intelligence value of survivor testimonies extended far beyond immediate tactical applications to provide strategic understanding of German administrative capabilities, resource allocation systems, and ideological objectives that had motivated occupation policies throughout conquered territories. American strategic planners began revising their assessments of enemy capabilities and war aims based on evidence that German leadership had implemented systematic civilian exploitation programs that went far beyond traditional military occupation procedures. The documentation of bureaucratic organization and administrative efficiency in implementing systematic cruelty influenced American understanding of the scale and coordination required for post-war denazification and reconstruction programs. The legal implications of survivor testimonies became apparent as American military lawyers recognized that the systematic nature of civilian exploitation documented through these interviews provided evidence for war crimes prosecutions that would require unprecedented international legal procedures and institutional frameworks. The accounts recorded by intelligence officers like Richardson contributed to the development of legal concepts and procedural frameworks that would eventually support international tribunals and establish precedents for addressing systematic crimes against civilian populations. The transformation of military intelligence gathering into historical documentation and legal evidence required new approaches to testimony preservation and verification that exceeded traditional military intelligence procedures. The propaganda and public information implications of survivor testimonies created strategic opportunities and challenges for American psychological warfare specialists who recognized both the value and the risks involved in sharing accounts of systematic civilian suffering with American and international audiences. The testimonies provided powerful evidence of enemy atrocities that could strengthen home front morale and international support for Allied war aims. But they also contained information so shocking that psychological warfare specialists worried about creating trauma and disbelief among civilian populations unprepared for such systematic accounts of human cruelty. The careful selection and presentation of survivor accounts required balancing truth-telling obligations with psychological impact considerations. The training and procedural modifications that emerged from early interrogation experiences led to systematic changes in American military education and intelligence doctrine that recognized the psychological challenges involved in documenting systematic civilian suffering. New training programs were developed for intelligence personnel who might be required to conduct interviews with trauma survivors, while psychological support procedures were implemented for soldiers whose duties involved exposure to accounts of systematic cruelty. The lessons learned from these interrogation programs influenced military training and doctrine development that would be applied in subsequent conflicts where American forces encountered evidence of systematic civilian exploitation. The historical documentation implications of survivor testimonies were recognized immediately by American commanders who understood that these accounts represented evidence of unprecedented historical importance that would be required for post-war justice proceedings and international understanding of Nazi crimes against civilian populations. Special procedures were developed for preserving, copying, and distributing survivor testimonies to ensure that this evidence would be available for historical research and legal proceedings, regardless of military casualties or equipment losses. The transformation of routine intelligence gathering into historical preservation required new approaches to documentation and archive management that exceeded traditional military intelligence procedures. The medical and psychological care implications of survivor testimonies influence the development of treatment programs and support services for liberated populations who required not only immediate medical attention, but long-term psychological care for trauma that exceeded anything in previous medical experience. American military medical personnel found themselves treating survivors whose physical and psychological conditions required new approaches to trauma care and rehabilitation that had not been covered in their medical training. The systematic nature of the suffering documented in survivor testimonies required medical responses that addressed not only individual trauma, but community-level psychological damage that affected entire populations. The interagency coordination requirements that emerged from survivor testimony programs required unprecedented cooperation between military intelligence services, legal departments, medical personnel, and civilian agencies that would be responsible for post-war reconstruction and refugee assistance. The systematic nature of civilian exploitation documented through these interviews required coordinated responses that exceeded the capabilities of any single military or civilian agency, leading to the development of new institutional frameworks and procedural coordination mechanisms. The integration of military intelligence gathering with civilian humanitarian assistance represented new approaches to post-conflict operations that would influence American military doctrine for decades. The long-term impact on individual soldiers who participated in survivor interrogation programs was profound and lasting, as many carried psychological burdens from these experiences throughout their post-war lives, while also serving as witnesses and advocates for historical accuracy and justice for victims of systematic civilian exploitation. Richardson and thousands of other American soldiers who had documented survivor testimonies became unofficial historians and advocates whose first-hand knowledge of systematic atrocities influenced their post-war careers, political activities, and community involvement. The psychological impact of documenting systematic civilian suffering created lifelong obligations to bear witness and ensure that the testimonies they had recorded would be preserved and understood by future generations. The strategic communication implications of survivor testimonies influenced the development of post-war information programs and educational initiatives designed to ensure that evidence of systematic civilian exploitation would be preserved and communicated to audiences who had not been directly exposed to survivor accounts. The systematic nature of the atrocities documented through military interrogation programs required new approaches to public education and historical preservation that could convey the scope and systematic nature of civilian suffering without creating trauma or disbelief among audiences unprepared for such accounts. The balance between historical accuracy and psychological impact considerations required sophisticated understanding of communication psychology and educational methodology that exceeded traditional military information operations capabilities. The documentation and preservation technologies employed by American forces for recording survivor testimonies represented significant advances in military intelligence gathering capabilities that would influence information management and historical preservation for decades beyond World War II. The systematic recording, transcription, and distribution of thousands of survivor accounts required new approaches to data management that went far beyond traditional military intelligence procedures to encompass historical documentation and legal evidence preservation. The development of standardized interview protocols, transcription procedures, and archive management systems demonstrated American organizational capabilities that would prove essential for post-war justice proceedings and historical research that depended on accurate preservation of first-hand testimony. The psychological assessment and trauma recognition capabilities that American medical personnel developed through exposure to systematic survivor testimonies contributed to significant advances in understanding and treating psychological trauma that had not been anticipated in pre-war medical training. The systematic nature of civilian suffering, documented through these interviews, required new approaches to trauma psychology that recognized the long-term effects of deliberate cruelty, social isolation, and systematic dehumanization on individual and community psychological health. The integration of psychological trauma recognition into military medical doctrine represented advances in combat stress and civilian trauma treatment that would influence American military and civilian medical practice throughout the post-war period. The legal and procedural frameworks that emerged from survivor testimony programs established precedents for international justice proceedings that would influence the development of war crimes tribunals and international humanitarian law for decades after World War II ended. The systematic documentation of civilian exploitation through military intelligence gathering procedures provided legal evidence that supported new approaches to international justice that recognized systematic crimes against civilian populations as distinct categories requiring specialized legal frameworks and institutional responses. The transformation of military intelligence into legal evidence required new approaches to testimony verification, chain of custody procedures, and documentary evidence preservation that exceeded traditional military intelligence capabilities. The intelligence analysis and strategic assessment capabilities that American forces developed through processing survivor testimonies provided new approaches to understanding enemy capabilities, administrative systems, and ideological objectives that went far beyond traditional military intelligence analysis focused on tactical and operational information. The systematic nature of civilian exploitation documented through these interviews required analytical frameworks that could assess the administrative capacity, resource allocation, and coordination capabilities needed to implement systematic policies across conquered territories. The integration of civilian testimony analysis into strategic intelligence assessment represented advances in understanding enemy society and administrative capabilities that would influence American intelligence doctrine throughout the Cold War period. The communication and translation capabilities that American forces developed for conducting interviews with survivors from dozens of different national and linguistic backgrounds demonstrated organizational flexibility and cultural competence that exceeded pre-war military planning assumptions. The systematic documentation of survivor testimonies required translation services, cultural interpretation, and communication protocols that could accommodate linguistic diversity while maintaining accuracy and sensitivity to cultural factors that influence testimony reliability and psychological comfort. The development of multilingual intelligence gathering capabilities represented advances in military linguistics and cultural competence that would influence American military operations in diverse cultural environments throughout the post-war period. The organizational and procedural innovations that emerged from survivor testimony programs established new approaches to military-civilian cooperation that would influence American post-conflict operations and humanitarian assistance programs for decades beyond World War II. The integration of military intelligence, gathering with civilian trauma care, legal documentation, and humanitarian assistance required new institutional frameworks and procedural coordination that exceeded traditional military organizational capabilities. The development of integrated civil-military approaches to post-conflict operations represented advances in organizational innovation that would influence American military doctrine for complex humanitarian emergencies and post-conflict reconstruction throughout the Cold War period and beyond. The propaganda and psychological warfare implications of survivor testimonies provided new approaches to strategic communication that recognized both the value and the risks involved in sharing accounts of systematic civilian suffering with domestic and international audiences. The careful selection, presentation, and distribution of survivor accounts required sophisticated understanding of communication psychology, audience analysis, and message effectiveness that went beyond traditional military information operations to encompass public education, diplomatic communication, and historical preservation objectives. The integration of psychological warfare considerations with historical documentation requirements represented advances in strategic communication that would influence American public diplomacy and information operations throughout the post-war period. The training and education innovations that resulted from survivor testimony programs established new approaches to military education that recognized the psychological challenges involved in documenting systematic civilian suffering and the professional obligations associated with historical witness responsibilities. The development of specialized training programs for personnel who might be required to conduct interviews with trauma survivors represented advances in military professional education that integrated psychological awareness, historical consciousness, and legal responsibility into traditional military training frameworks. The recognition that military personnel might serve as historical witnesses and legal documentation specialists required new approaches to professional development that exceeded traditional military education focused solely on tactical and operational competence. The technological and methodological legacy of survivor testimony programs influenced post-war developments in oral history, documentary preservation, and trauma research that would contribute to civilian applications in psychology, sociology, and historical research throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The systematic approaches to interview methodology, testimony verification, and psychological support that American military personnel developed during these programs provided foundations for civilian research and therapeutic applications that would influence academic and medical practice for decades after the war ended. The transformation of military intelligence, gathering into historical documentation and trauma research, represented technological and methodological innovations that would prove valuable for understanding and addressing civilian suffering in subsequent conflicts and humanitarian crises. The profound irony of these interrogation sessions lay in the reversal of expected roles, as American soldiers who had been trained to inflict and endure physical violence found themselves psychologically devastated by words alone, testimonies that revealed systematic cruelty beyond anything they had encountered in combat. Richardson and thousands of other intelligence officers discovered that the hardening they had developed through months of battlefield experience offered no protection against the systematic accounts of deliberate civilian suffering that challenged their fundamental understanding of human nature and civilized society. The contrast was stark and disturbing. Men who could function effectively under artillery fire and machine gun attacks found themselves struggling to maintain composure while recording testimonies that revealed the systematic application of cruelty as administrative policy. The transformation of these soldiers from warriors into witnesses represented a profound shift in their understanding of their military service and its broader historical significance, as they realized that their role in documenting survivor testimonies might prove more important than their combat achievements in determining how the war would be remembered and understood by future generations. Richardson's notebook, filled with testimony that would influence war crimes trials and historical research for decades to come, represented a different form of service to his country that required moral courage and psychological endurance rather than physical bravery and tactical competence. The soldiers who conducted these interviews carried forward not only their own combat experiences, but the voices of survivors who had entrusted them with testimonies of systematic suffering. The strategic implications of these interrogation programs extended far beyond their immediate intelligence value to establish foundations for post-war international justice, historical understanding, and prevention efforts that would influence global approaches to civilian protection and human rights for generations beyond World War II. The systematic documentation of survivor testimonies provided evidence that supported new legal frameworks for addressing crimes against civilian populations, while creating historical records that would serve as permanent testimony to systematic suffering that many survivors believed would never be understood or believed by those who had not experienced it directly. The voices preserved through military intelligence gathering became integral to the broader victory achieved by Allied forces in World War II. The human legacy of these interrogation sessions continues to resonate through the recognition that true strength in warfare sometimes requires the courage to listen rather than fight, to preserve rather than destroy, and to bear witness to suffering that challenges every assumption about human dignity and civilized behavior. The American soldiers who documented survivor testimonies demonstrated that military service could encompass moral and historical responsibilities that transcended immediate tactical objectives, creating permanent records of human experience that would serve justice, education, and prevention efforts long after the guns fell silent. Their notebooks became repositories of human testimony that transformed military intelligence gathering into historical preservation and moral witness, proving that sometimes the most important victories are won not through strength of arms, but through strength of character and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and systematic cruelty. If you want more untold stories of World War II, subscribe now to WWII Secret Archives, where history's darkest secrets are revealed.